Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm your moderator, Nick Palavita, and today we're going to look at a very important topic which just hit the New York Times. Very interesting statistic that by 2053, 30 years from now, 40% of all Americans' budget, the government's budget, will be used to pay for senior care, which is a big problem if we're going to take all of our money and use it for seniors. So with that, we're going to bring our panelists on. First of all, bring in the president of the network, Kim Calhoun, coming in now from the Raleigh-Durham area. And of course, we have a panel that stretches across the United States. As we move into San Francisco, we have Jim Eade, who's head of the Eade Foundation in San Francisco. And then in the LA area, we have Rick Rosner, who's from the Los Angeles area, who's a member of the Mega Society, which no one knows what that is, but Google it and you'll find out. No one knows what it is. So, Rick, it's really great. And then, of course, today's person who's going to give us the outline, what we're going to do by 2053, the author of America 2040 Still a Superpower. Maybe not if by 2053 we're using all our money to support seniors, the Honorable David M. Walker. David, I got a hot topic for you. As David K. Johnson says, it's worse than you think. The New York Times is saying that, well, by 2053, 40% of all Americans' U.S. government's budget is going to be used to support seniors. Are we looking at U.S. becoming another Japan? In other words, falling into second or maybe third world status? I don't see where this is stopping. So,
well, let's start off by acknowledging the significance of this date, September 11. September 11, 2001, we probably all know where we were and what we were doing. At the time, I was Comptroller General of the United States, and I was at the GAO headquarters in Washington, D.C. Several thousand people lost their lives in New York. People lost their lives in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, United Flight 93. People lost their lives in the Pentagon and Arlington, Virginia. But what a lot of people forget about is about 3,000 people have lost their lives since 9/11 from illnesses associated with the debris and the things that were in the air as a result of 9/11 at the towers. And over 8,000 people have lost their lives in the global war on terrorism. So, may we never forget, and hopefully we never see that happen again. But with that, look, we have been on an imprudent and unsustainable fiscal path for a number of years, and every major fiscal and monetary agency in Washington, D.C. has noted that, and Fitch has recently downgraded the credit rating of the United States because nothing is really being done about it. One of the biggest drivers is demographics. Demographics are destiny. The good news is we're living longer. The bad news is that we have a lot of social insurance programs that are geared towards seniors, the two most prominent being Social Security and Medicare. And now we have many people who are actually living longer in retirement than they worked. And so the longer they live, then the more they're going to get paid through those programs. We also have a situation where healthcare costs we pay roughly double what other major industrialized nations do as a percentage of GDP, and yet we get below average results. And needless to say, healthcare costs for seniors tend to be much higher than average, in part because of the impact of life, and because you tend to have more chronic illnesses the older you get, if you will. But the thing you didn't mention, which is actually the fastest growing expense, and I'm not sure if the New York Times acknowledged it or not, is interest on the debt. And in 2 years, we're going to pay $1 trillion in interest. And what do you get for interest? Nothing.
So we were getting older. For the past 3-4 years, our expected lifespan has been going down. It's down to 78 or 79 in the U.S., compared to Japan, where it's in the mid 80s. But Japan is close to 30% people over 65. We're at about 17% people over 65. But yeah, we're headed, and the UN says that life expectancy in developed countries is headed to 100. So, and we've got the boomers own everything. And when we don't die, then the next generations don't get to inherit anything. It's a mess.
Of course, in the short term, Rick, the reason life expectancy has gone down is primarily attributable to COVID-19, which is, a once in 100-year typically situation. Or at least let's hope that it is. The last time we had a major pandemic like that was in the early 1900s.
Yeah, COVID and opioids.
Yeah, that's right. For younger people in particular, that's correct.
And COVID has killed about one senior in 40 in America. It's a huge national tragedy.
Yeah, it is. So we're also going to have to reform. We're going to have to reform Social Security. We're going to have to reform Medicare. You have a disproportionate number of seniors over time that will probably be on Medicaid, which is health care for the poor, because they may outlive their resources. That's another real risk that you have when you live longer, especially with regard to long-term care, which is a lot more than health care. It's basic living expenses and accommodations. And long-term care, there's no social insurance program for long-term care, although it is covered by Medicaid. But in order to be eligible for Medicaid, you have to meet a poverty standard.
Okay, Dave, can I ask you a question?
We have another problem that's very concerning to me, and it's something that I predicted a few years ago that would happen, which is we have a decline in our medical care providers. And that I perceive in the next 10 years, we don't have it as it is, enough doctors for our citizens here in the United States. It's just not worth it for them to become a doctor anymore. Insurance gets all the money. They have student debts and debts of insurance and other medical bills, bills for themselves that are just increasing to the point, why do it? So we are not going to have enough doctors and medical care for our people.
Hey, Kim, along those same lines, and I want to follow up and ask David a question if he has any solutions, even within what he's doing with no labels and some of the other things that he's doing, because it's not just doctors. I know here in Durham that there is a shortage. I want to say that we're like at 20% shortage or something like that of police officers. So that's first responders. Parks and Rec is actually closing down, including some events that are way in the future, not that way in the future, but like Christmas events, because they don't have enough people, enough elves, quote unquote, to work on some of these things that are existing. So what can we do when there is a frustration or a laziness? I won't say laziness, but there is a frustration, I guess, around pay and a number of other things that people are not going to a lot of these jobs that traditionally were very historically wanted jobs, whether that is being a doctor, whether that's being a policeman, because I don't think it's just here in North Carolina. I think it's in DC. I think it's in New York. I think it's in a variety of places that there is a shortage of folks that are wanting to go into these fields and everything, partially because of what Kim just said, that is they are frustrated that they are not getting the reward and the recognition that they deserve and everything. But what is your take, and how can we address that? I know historically there were like workfare programs, and maybe we got to do workfare for first responders and those kind of jobs. But any thoughts that you have, Dave?
Well, several things with regard to healthcare. We are just now on the leading edge of finding out what's going to happen with regard to artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence might end up affecting a lot of different professions, including the healthcare profession. We're also seeing that in certain parts of the country, we already have an acute crisis with regard to not enough medical professionals. We're going to see, I think, a delegation of more responsibility to nurse practitioners and to RNs. My daughter-in-law happens to be an RN, and so we're going to see that happening. With regard to first responders, I think, frankly, the biggest problem is the fact that they've been under attack. That they have, you have some people who are first responders, in particular the police, who abuse their responsibility and authority, but a vast majority do not. And yet, too many people have tried to, say one size fits all and try to demonize them. You've had politicians who've tried to be able to cut the budgets of the police department, who've not had their back, in circumstances where they should have had their back. They're concerned with regard to personal liability, to the extent that they do something that they think is acceptable, but gets blown out of proportion. So I think, and candidly, I think right now, without mentioning any names, because I don't think that's appropriate, I think there's a lot of evidence that, that one of the founding principles that we had, which was rule of law and equal justice under the law, is not taking place at many different levels, local, state, and federal level. And so I think we need to get back to the basics. We need to end up being true to the principles and values under which we were founded, while recognizing that we always need to try to strive to form a more perfect union.
Hey, Dave, along the same
David,
lines.
do you believe that equal justice, that truly means what is right for the goose is right for the gander? In other words, what the government, we should hold the government accountable for the same things that they pressure and hold us accountable for, like the IRS and, other government offices as well?
We should hold these truths to be self-evident, that the law should apply to everybody equally, irrespective of your age, your race, your gender, your religion, your ethnic origin, your wealth. They should apply equally.
Your job position.
Yeah, no, we should have equal justice, irrespective.
I agree.
So here comes a ton of robots. If you look at Japan, where they have too few young people to service all the old people, we're going to have medical robots. We're going to have companion robots. We're going to have caregiving robots. And then when it comes to policing, like I've lived in New York, I've lived in LA. New York has cops on the street, which and a ton of cops. LA is relatively under-policed, which leads to kind of a lone wolf at the Alamo kind of attitude, which leads to problems. When you start adding, AI to policing, where cops get in the moment guides to, maybe you don't shoot that guy, maybe hold off, and anyway, everything's going to get all AI'd up.
Hey, David, along those same lines, I was just wondering, because I know locally here in North Carolina, there has been some conversations around hiring private security, which sounds good to some degree because it will beef up the police. But then I worry about like the Pinkerton kind of organizations that exist and everything. And if we don't run into a problem, if we have too much private security versus public security in terms of trying to enhance what the police are doing. Because I know that there was a conversation, I just recently read a article that was talking about doing that. I want to say on some of our college campuses, as well as some of our public streets as well and everything. But I was wondering your thoughts around that. And is there a fear of a mob mentality that could kind of like take over as well if we go too much into the private security aspect of policing?
Well, I'll be quick, and I know James and Rick raised their hands, so we ought to turn to them. But look, it should be a public responsibility that the private sector might enhance to the extent necessary. But to the extent that the public is not doing its job, you have to expect that the private sector in certain circumstances will stand up. That's not the right answer. The public sector needs to do its job. If we remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-preservation is fundamental. And obviously public safety is a big part of that. And obviously the police and first responders are a big part of that. But we have too many places around this country that don't recognize that and aren't acting accordingly.
So California has some laws that horribly reflect police's inability to keep up with crime. You can go into a Rite Aid, a CVS, and shoplift up to $950 worth of stuff without consequence. because the police can't deal. It's not worth, and there are a bunch of other property crimes that just aren't policed. And also in the private sector, it's hard to draw people to the private sector because of liability issues. You can't, that person who's shoplifting $750 worth of stuff, a private guard can't do anything about it without risking, getting sued. We're going to need more automation to augment all this stuff.
Rick, there's some stores that are starting pricing at $1,000 and above, and you get a coupon at at checkout for that reason.
Yeah. James has had his hand up for a while.
Thank you. And I want to not get into, I want to get back to the subject matter and to thank you also for setting the tone on this date, 9/11. That was very appropriate of you, and I appreciate it. And also, I liked the way you set this up. But 2053, by the climate change parameters of the expectations, the Arctic ice will have melted, the oceans would have risen, and what land remains would have been burnt to the crisps. So, we have to be careful projecting into the future. 2053 is a long ways away, but your point is well taken. We're not paying attention to the trends, and the trends are remarkably telling us something loud and clear. We have an aging population. Now, we don't have to wonder what will happen. We can look to Japan to see what's happening because it's happening there now. Now, Japan is fine. It's still operating as a good country. I don't think America is in any immediate danger, but the boomers are aging rapidly, and it's about, 10,000 a year that are becoming seniors now?
A day.
A day, 10,000.
Sorry, thank you. I misspoke. Thank you. So it's like, an incredible increase. And so the structure that was put in place in the 1930s for Social Security, which we all believe in, I hope, because it is part of our society, a just society, it wasn't built for this. It has to be restructured. And you're absolutely right, putting your finger on the medical costs. We have to rein them in. We have to start being sane about it. But what we have is a medical pharmaceutical companies that finance the campaign of politicians who pass laws that favor them. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to make a sensible medical program? We have the resources. Do we have the political will to do it? And once we do that, we still are not out of the woods. But look, China is facing the same thing even more dramatically than the United States is. This is a global problem. This isn't just the United States problem. Thank you.
No, and our demographic challenges aren't nearly as significant as some other countries, and including Japan, including China, including Russia, including many other countries. But we have to rely upon immigration more now because our birth rate is basically enough to sustain our current population, and in fact, recently has been not enough to sustain our current population. But that's also why we have to end up taking a hard look at our immigration laws and to focus on the reality of not only demographics, but on the reality that we're in a global competition with regard from an economic standpoint and a war for talent. And we need to end up modifying our immigration laws to recognize that reality. On healthcare, look, I think we haven't had a debate about something that is fundamental and is essential, and that is how much universal health care, and I underline the words universal health care, is appropriate, affordable, and sustainable. I would argue that the United States should have a universal health care program that focuses on two things: preventative and wellness, which you want as big a pool as you can, and it's in everybody's collective interest to have that. And with turnover in the workforce, you may not get as much through the normal employer system that way. So preventative and wellness and catastrophic protection. The number one cause of bankruptcy in this country is healthcare cost. And catastrophic differs based upon your income and wealth. We're always going to do more for the poor. We're always going to do more for the disabled. We're always going to do more for veterans, and we should, okay? But what the government has done is it's promised too much to too many, and it's subsidized too many. In addition, it doesn't pay for outcomes. It pays for activities. Furthermore, we allow advertising of prescription drugs in this country. Most industrialized nations, not all, most industrialized nations don't, because it fuels demand. And it puts physicians in a very tough position to try to prescribe things that they may or may not agree with, if you will, and it drives costs. So, there's a number of things that need to be done. There are a couple of chapters in my book where I talk about some of the things that not only need to be done, but more importantly, that over 80% of Americans agree need to be done. By the way, last thing is, in my view, there's only two things that shouldn't have an annual cap on how much we spend at the federal level. Only two. Number one, Social Security, because it is the most important and popular social insurance program. We can make the numbers work. We know how to calculate. I was a trustee of Social Security and Medicare. We can do that. We don't need to have a cap because we know how to make it work. And secondly, interest, because we can't have a cap. We got to pay what we got to pay, right? But on healthcare, you can't write a blank check for healthcare. Not even Sweden and other countries that have socialized medicine cradle to grave do that. And we have to understand that. So I think we do have enough resources. I don't think we allocate them properly. Same thing with regard to defense. I think we have enough resources. I just don't think we allocate them properly. And Congress is a big part of the problem that they try to micromanage things, and they want us to do things that we don't need to do because it means jobs in their district or, whatever it might be. So number of transformational changes necessary. Thanks for the question.
Preventative health care runs into political correctness.
Yeah.
If you're obese, COVID has a much greater chance of killing you, but telling people to lose weight, Bill Maher, I don't love him, but he was bitching throughout COVID saying we should be telling people to lose weight to help save lives. And that applies to all sorts of diseases. And we don't talk about that because that's body shaming. And we have to shift our economy from the whole Western world needs to figure out how to make economies work when populations aren't growing. People are having fewer kids. One, because younger people are a little bit bummed about the world. And two, because there's so much amazing entertainment and stuff in the world that people are distracted from pumping out babies. And people live longer. And instead of leaving a legacy by having kids, people are leaving a legacy by just not dying.
Maybe we need more blackouts. We tend to have a bump in the population every time. And the way things are going, we're probably going to have a lot more brownouts and blackouts.
Hey, David, along those same lines, and I saw that Shaquille and Lee's got their questions, hands up as well. But Jim actually brought up a point that I was wondering, should we do more funding around? Because climate change is oftentimes things of what people talk about. We think it of being something that's far away, but a friend of mine, well, actually an acquaintance, just came back from an Alaska cruise, and they literally said that they could see the results of the climate change in the sense of the icebergs melting and other things while they were on that cruise. So they literally noted that while they were on their cruise to Alaska, and they just recently got back. So it sounds like it may be more of a concern than we are giving it credit for. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about it as to whether it's something that we...
First, climate change is real, and man plays a role in climate change. But it has been hyped way too much. If you look back in history, you'll see that we've gone through various cycles in the past. Do we need to do things differently? Yes. But we need to be realistic about how quickly we can and should do things, especially with regard to energy strategy. We need an all of the above strategy transitioning over a lot longer period of time to where we get to be carbon neutral. It's going to take longer. We need to understand that. Secondly, the climate does not respect geopolitical boundaries. And we need to understand that if we don't get countries like, China and India and in Africa and other places, if we don't get them to play ball, we're not going to solve the problem. Okay. Furthermore, we also have to recognize the fact that many of the things that we're pushing, we're dependent upon other countries in order to be able to achieve those objectives. If you talk about the batteries associated with electric vehicles, where are the minerals that we get in order to be able to build those batteries, and where are they built? The answer is China. Okay, China. Okay. And so my view is it's real. We need to take it seriously, but it's been overhyped, and we have not properly analyzed what needs to be done, how to get it done, and within what realistic time frame can we get it done. And frankly, one of the reasons that I think that China and Russia didn't come to the G20 summit is that, climate change is kind of leading our agenda on about everything that we talk about. And they're not interested in talking about that. Now, they got other things going on, Ukraine being one, and some economic challenges, especially on the real estate side in China. But, it needs to be a priority, but it is not the top priority. The world is going to exist in 2053. Count on it. Because keep in mind, a number of these climate people told us we'd already be underwater by now. If you go back 50 years ago.
Okay, Lee. You're muted.
Shaquille's had his hand up for a while. Maybe
Okay.
we'll
You want to go first? Okay, Dave, when it comes to homeowners insurance or car insurance, we don't put in for normal wear and tear, for wipers, for oil changes. Why with health insurance? I understand catastrophic, I understand preventive, but why do we nickel and dime health insurance for going for any other reason? Why is that stuff covered everyday illnesses or procedures?
Well, you're making my point, Lee, and my point is I think that we ought to have a universal plan, public plan, that's delivered through the private sector and the not-for-profit sector that focuses on preventative wellness and catastrophic. And if more is going to be provided than that, then it's done through employers, it's done through unions, it's done through trade associations. It's a way that they can attract and retain talent. Okay. But I think there is a level of healthcare that is in our broad-based societal interest that we ought to be providing. We ought to be paying for it differently. Pardon me. And we ought to have a cap on how much we're going to spend every year on it.
Thank you. Just one follow-up question. In terms of COVID, not so much COVID itself or the vaccines, but why do these manufacturers have immunity?
I didn't vote for that.
I know, but no other product do we have immunity for people for injuries caused by their products, do we?
Gun manufacturers have.
No, that's not true. That's not true in fairness. Gun manufacturers do not have immunity when guns something goes wrong because of the gun, the way it's manufactured. They shouldn't be sued when people use them inappropriately, just as car manufacturers shouldn't be on the hook because I hit somebody with a car. We don't go after the car company. But if a car's manufactured wrong, like Pinto, you should be able to go after the car company.
But I mean, with pharmaceutical, I mean, more than 6 billion people have been vaxxed against COVID.
And why aren't they on the hook for each one for vaccine injuries? That's my question. Why do they have blanket immunity?
Because otherwise they couldn't financially.
If it's a safe product, what's the difference?
Well, part of the problem here is, Lee, this thing was politicized, let's face it. Okay. In addition to that, these vaccines did not go through the normal testing procedures.
Okay.
And so as a result, I would imagine that some of the pharmaceutical companies were even more concerned about it because it was rushed, and it was rushed at the request of the government. I mean, was it Project Warp Speed or whatever, was incredibly successful. The problem is that the vaccines have been misrepresented to the American people about what they would do and what their effectiveness might be.
David, isn't part of the problem also the states and everything? Because like I said, I'm here and I know Nick's here as well in North Carolina, and North Carolina is very much a state that depends on pharmaceuticals more so now than they used to, because the tobacco industry has been under attack for a number of years, and some other industries that were traditionally our strong suits. But I would say that pharmaceuticals and biotech is the leading economic engine of North Carolina. So I'm sure that North Carolina is probably not wanting to have any pushback to the companies because that would damage the state of North Carolina, which is the 8th ranked state, as Steve likes to point out, and all in that space. So my question is, isn't that an issue as well as this kind of parochial kind of attitude that a lot of our governments have and everything? Because I'm sure that both the Republicans and the Democrats would fight against any sort of pushback with the pharmaceutical companies when they are such a big part of North Carolina's economy.
Well, I come back to what I said before. I think the reason that they were given an exemption is because of Project Warp Speed, where we wanted to get something done quickly. We did a lot of shortcuts in order to get it to market, and that's why. Now, personally, I've had 3 jabs, the original 2, and then 1 after that. And I don't have serious underlying health conditions, irrespective of my age. And as was mentioned before, obesity is a major problem in the United States, okay, which we ought to take on head on, okay? And there's a way to do it in a respectful way. You can tell people what are some of the adverse health and life expectancy consequences and things of that nature, and encourage them to do something without shaming them. But personally, I've had my last jab for COVID.
I've had 7, which is 1 more than I had to lie to get the last one because I was traveling to England, which has been pretty sloppy with COVID. And just quickly, whatever the jab does to you in terms of spike proteins, getting COVID floods your body with between 80 and 8,000 times as much spike protein as the vax does.
Right. You get more immunity from having had it than you do from getting the spike. My brother and sister-in-law just came back from a cruise in the UK, and they've had every vax you can have. They have every one, and they've gotten COVID again.
Well, Dave, you make the point that those who got the COVID already, such as myself, there's no need to get the vaccine.
Well, it depends on whether you have. My view is it doesn't have to do with age. It has to do with whether or not you have serious underlying health conditions, in particular respiratory issues. Okay, no matter what your age is, and the issue is the vaccine does not keep you from getting the COVID. The vaccine is designed to try to reduce the possibility that you have to have hospitalization. And that if you do, that you will live.
And death.
Right, and death. And that you will live if you do get it. Correct.
And there's stuff you can do. There's Paxlovid and metformin if you get it, which knocks down the severity by about 40%.
But the people don't make as much money on that, Rick. Let's understand what's going on here. This is all about the money.
Agreed.
Right.
And
Speaking of
fear
money, we're going to bring in
control.
Shaquille
And fear
Money
and
Man.
control. That's what it's all about.
Shaquille, floor is yours.
Yeah, well, we've moved past what I was going to respond to a while ago, which was about US healthcare in general and also the Social Security Service. But I'll just quickly address the COVID vaccine if I can. I think that I find it quite strange when people label those who don't want to take the vaccine as being conspiracy nuts. The way that this was handled by big media and the tech companies, what are you expecting? And as you know, a lot of people on this network know, I asked a question a couple of years ago on one of our shows where I said, we're being told to listen to the government, but when we say anything on Facebook or on other tech platforms, we're being told that we have to listen to the CDC. But what the CDC in America is saying is totally different to what the TGA in Australia is saying. So what are we supposed to do? And in Australia, different states' health ministers were saying different things to us. In Canada, they were told that they could take the Pfizer and the Moderna and mix them, and they'd be able to travel to the United States after they did that. They took them, they went down to the US, and cruise ships said to them, although America has let you in, we're not going to recognize you as being vaccinated. So now you need to go back to Canada and get another Pfizer vaccine or a Moderna vaccine. And of course, you weren't eligible because you already had 2 vaccines. I thought that those were perfectly reasonable questions to ask. And when you shut people down, people are going to start to conclude that the government's doing something wrong or that we're being hidden, information's being hidden. And, look, we all know the politicians didn't really know what was happening. Everybody was just trying to do their best. But why do you then want to shut down people's conversations when they're asking questions? That never made sense to me during those times. But I'll just come back, Dave, to a couple of comments that you made, both about climate change and healthcare and social security in the US. Let's just take Africa for a moment. Al Gore talked about this in, I think it was the sequel to the original An Inconvenient Truth. He went to India, and I think also he was in Africa, and the Indians had said to him, "We'll do it when we have the same sort of quality of life as you guys have." I think that's a fair call. But, you know, Africa, which obviously doesn't have a great record on this, what are they supposed to do? They're relatively poor. They've got 1.3 billion people living across 56 countries. There's a lot of division and corruption in Africa. I think it's very hard for us to go in there and say, hey, you know, you should switch to solar panels, because we're converting to solar panels, but we haven't converted all the way. You know, we still have our oil when we want it. We still have our coal when we want it. I think it's a hard argument. And to come back to, I know you probably already know what I'm going to say about healthcare and social security. Healthcare, look, the AMA needs to be pulled into line. The pharmaceutical companies need to be pulled into line. It's not fair for them to give hundreds of millions of dollars to universities to reduce the amount of medical graduates. The US has half the amount of doctors as any other Western country per capita, and you've got approximately double the cost. I mean, it's not a hard leap to find out what could be a contributing factor. And so what you've got private enterprise that are able to, you know, cement their position, and then government saying, well, or people saying, well, healthcare is not very fair. So what we need to do is we need to increase taxes effectively is what's going to pay for it. Whether you tax differently or not, that's a different issue. But effectively, you have to increase taxes to pay for all of this without actually requiring some of those private enterprises to act more responsibly. And the last thing I'll just say is in relation to Social Security. Australia has finally decided to put on its agenda the inheritance tax, which I'm sure that you and most other panelists know is the one tax that I absolutely despise. I think it's a disgusting tax and it's an inefficient tax. But without going into a debate on that, I think that the generation that's come before mine is really needs to have a look at itself just a little bit and take some responsibility for what that generation has created. Because that's a generation that has acted towards our generation, the people that are younger than me, as if we're supposed to be all responsible, conservative kind of kids with no vices. You know, the generation that came before us, you're off smoking marijuana, you're having riots, you're protesting. I know you had the Vietnam War. I know the times were different, okay? But you had a pretty good time, and you also had less children. And you also showed our generation the highest level of divorce rates. Most people in my generation have come from families that were torn apart. We didn't want to go through it again. We are living in a world where when you're 20, you can't afford to go and buy a house. You can't go to college and just, you know, work part-time and pay college off. You know, what kind of job could you do part-time while you're at college and pay it off? We don't have those same opportunities. And then we're told, well, look, what we're going to do is we're going to fix the social security problem that we've been warned about for decades by saying to you that your costs are going to be higher. It's going to be harder for you to get into the property market. Your university costs are going to be substantially higher. You're going to have kids later in life and less off them. They probably won't be able to go to a private school if you did, because you probably won't be able to afford to send them there. Oh, and by the way, we're going to increase your retirement age. And we're going to do that because our generation needs to make sure this problem is solved for us. But what happens in 30 years from now? In 30 years from now, when most of the boomers have passed away, what's my generation going to be left with? What are we supposed to do with the children that we do have? Are we supposed to have the same solution that's being offered to us now, that there's a shortage of people? So what we will do is we won't encourage young people to get married and give them the financial resources to have children. We'll just bring new immigrants in. That'll be our solution. I think we're doing a massive disservice by ignoring some of the social issues and social pressures that has caused people to have falling birth rates, falling marriage rates, and all of that sort of stuff. I think that's an important thing for us to focus on.
Shaquille's right. The boomers have a demographic hammer because there are more of us and have been more of us since the 60s, we get what we want at the expense of other generations because we have the voting force.
But Gen X, I think, is bigger now.
So they need to vote. We
Some-
need the
because some
boomers
boomers
need
have
to.
passed
We
away.
need to. Nothing gets done. I think this current Congress has perhaps passed zero legislation. We're the most polarized we've been maybe since the Civil War, which means we can't solve any of these problems because we can't pass any legislation. We got to figure out how to reduce polarization and make government effective again.
Rick, the way you do that is you have to engage the American people in a meaningful way with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, which is not what Washington does. I'll remind you that one of the things that's included in my book, American 2040: Still a Superpower ? Is the results of a 10,000-mile, 27-state national fiscal responsibility bus tour and the results of two special forums with representative groups of voters in a swing state in the North and the South, where we got 77 to 97% agreement on specific reforms with regard to the budget, taxes, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare, defense, government organization operations, political reforms, because the people are a lot smarter than the politicians realize. They can handle the truth. They know we need to make tough choices. They're willing to accept them if they're part of a comprehensive goal-based plan consistent with principles and values that bring them together and apart. What Washington does is they're in stalemate, and then when they try to do something, they try to come up with a solution in Washington without engaging the people and do a sell job on them. And that's why we're going nowhere, along with, gerrymandering and too much money in politics and lack of term limits, and we could go on and on. But there is a way to solve this problem, but it means that we need to address it in a fundamentally different way than Washington is accustomed to doing.
Hey, David, along those same lines, I'm just curious because you just mentioned that and I was not aware of that fact and everything. But the boomers, and definitely I'm part of that. I think most of the group here is part of that, except for Shaquille. And all along those lines were considered to be relatively liberal and all in that space. And I'm not sure what the demographic breakdown is of Gen X and whether they are seen as more liberal, less liberal, or where they are. And I was just wondering, as one that studies economics and politics, what your impression is of Gen X, because it is a new generation that's coming up. I want to say I guess 14, 15, my nephews might be part of that, or they may be part of Generation Y. But what is your perception of this new, bigger block? Because I'm not even sure that I have an understanding of what their issues are and all along those lines.
I haven't seen detailed polling on it. My gut feeling is they're somewhat more progressive than the baby boomers. But here's the deal. Let's go back to Social Security, something Shaquille said. Mm-hmm. We should have solved Social Security years ago. The last time that we did Social Security reform was 1983. We didn't consider known demographic trends. The next time that we reform it, we have to consider known demographic trends. The interesting thing is it's probably one of the easiest things to solve. And why? Because seniors think they're going to get taken advantage of. There are other words I could use, but I won't. And that's not going to happen because they vote with more propensity than any other segment of the population, and it wouldn't be fair because they don't have time to make any changes. Younger people don't think they're going to get anything from Social Security, and they're wrong. So in effect, you have a way to reform this program that this time considers demographic trends. That'll be a combination of additional revenues and somewhat benefits restructuring. And you can exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans. I call that a win. But the biggest deficit that we have in Washington is not a budget deficit, which is huge. It's a leadership deficit. We have no leadership. And there's not a party of fiscal responsibility anymore. And people are afraid of their shadow to be able to make tough choices on issues that the people know need to be made.
And people
I'll just say,
consume
Dave,
media.
in relation to all generations benefiting. Some generation, if you take Australia, for example, very few people who are younger would even rely on the pension, the old age pension, because we have a thing called superannuation, which is managed.
I'm familiar with it, yeah.
But, people, even within that superannuation system, people go, well, do I trust the rules? Because whatever you'd say to young people when you're 20, you need to do all of this, and you might be able to retire 10 years earlier than everyone else at 50. But in that 30-year period of time, the government changes the rules, they change the deeming rate, they change the age of retirement, they change the discount on the taxes. All these things change, and you think, well, I shouldn't really be in that system if I can help it, which is why I left Australia in the first place, was so that I could have opportunities outside. I also just want to address, though, I think the elephant in the room when it comes to what's happening in the US, and to some degree, some other countries that have similar issues, which is, if we're going to compare ourselves to the kinds of social services that they have in Europe, I don't know why there is so much resistance on both sides of politics to having a tax system which is similar. In the first place, we know that the United States was taxing about 25% of the economy. I think that's ticked up a little bit during COVID. I think at the moment it's around 27% of the GDP. We see the OECD average at 33%. So an increase of 6% is a really significant increase. You guys have got a $27 trillion economy. So 6% of that, if you do the maths, is a massive increase in the amount of government expenditure. I think by having a more coherent tax system, not something which is so complicated, and also not something which is as progressive as it is. I'm not saying that the top rate has to come down. It just doesn't need to be as progressive. And a broader based tax system would go a long way. But the US never seems to want to address that. They either want to address revenue and not talk about spending, or they only want to talk about spending and not talk about revenue. Those things are connected. I don't think it's an insurmountable problem, but I think that the political parties in the US and Australia and Canada and all the other countries that face these issues, they need to put their own politics aside and their desire for power aside to actually address these issues, because at some point people are going to have enough. And I think that point will come when the millennials and the next generation, Gen Z, says, hey, we're stuck paying for all of this and we're not getting anything because you've actually cancelled the program altogether, for example, because you couldn't afford it anymore.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with the United States that is what's right with the United States can't fix. And I think we need to be rational about this, which is what I'm hearing Dave talking about. If we applied just rational behavior, then these problems are solvable. And what I'm hearing you say, Shaquille, is we're not talking to each other. And that's right on the money. We're not talking. We're not listening to one another. The across the aisle kind of conversations that used to take place are not taking place anymore. It's a zero-sum game in Washington. And we've got to change that. And we've got to change that by voting in some people that are going to listen. And it's not so much, be one issue kind of voter. It's kind of person, it's someone who's going to work with the others who might have different opinions. I grew up when people could disagree with one another and still be friends. And this is not happening now. And so what we're having now is a divided states of America. And what we have to do is remember what unifies us. And it's those principles that we all agreed on: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the focal point of being in the United States. It's what we have to get back to.
Well, and it's one of the reasons that No Labels, which I'm one of the national co-founders of, is prepared to run a third option for president and vice president on a unity ticket focused on solutions to the problems that Americans are concerned about and that we need to address if the Republicans nominate Trump and if the Democrats nominate Biden or another far left candidate. The American people are not happy. We're not making progress. The hole is so deep. We waited so long that everything has to be on the table. Shaquille, the number you gave with regard to taxes, the percentage you gave must be federal, state, and local, because federal is well under 20%. Spending is at 25% and rising of GDP. Okay. So the gap is getting greater. We're going to have to reform social insurance programs to make them solvent, sustainable, secure, reprioritize and reduce projected discretionary spending, including defense. And we're going to have to engage in comprehensive tax reform that will generate more growth, but more revenue. And we can't solve this problem just with growth. The math doesn't come close to working. And you're right. First, you have to talk about what's a reasonable level of taxation to solve the problem, and then how best to achieve that revenue, right? And we have a way too complex system. We've got over 40% of people don't pay any income taxes at all. You know, we've got way too many deductions, exemptions, exclusions, 1.5 trillion plus a year. The IRS is outgunned big time with regard to tax shelters and other types of. I'm not going to say tax minimization. I'm going to say tax evasion mechanisms, which are illegal. And so, yeah, we got a lot of work to do, but it is solvable with leadership.
I will confirm that
Media-
that number is the total average of the total tax take,
Okay,
which does distort things a little bit because some states tax higher.
Yeah, that's right. That's
What
right.
can I do? But
It's
but,
the
but ultimately, when you look at other countries and you look at what their taxes are as a percentage of their GDP, it gives you a guide as to what you should be looking at. And other than what we've talked about, I don't really know of anybody in mainstream media or any mainstream politicians that will actually talk about taxes in that way, as in what percentage of the total GDP of our country should we be targeting, and then how best to get there. All I hear is we should increase taxes on the rich, or we should decrease, we should decrease deductions or whatever. And sorry, Rick, I'll just say one last thing. The unfairness of the system, and I think it's more pronounced in the US, but because Australia, for example, had a very similar system, we've changed it. The unfairness of it is, of the people that are paying taxes, that two people in very similar economic positions may pay completely different rates. That's where the real unfairness comes, is that oftentimes a high income earner, which is really brand new money, is having to fork over what's really almost a punitive amount of tax, whilst other people who have already got assets and have an increase in their asset values aren't having to pay anything. Or in some cases, like property investors, like Donald Trump and many others, they're getting a deduction. They've got an increase in the amount of their net wealth, and they have a deduction against the building structure, which they can use to offset the income that they do earn. I mean, it is an incredibly unfair system, I think, when two people in a similar economic position are paying completely different rates. That just doesn't make sense to me.
The media we consume promote anger and oversimplified, unworkable solutions. You know, you get things like taxation is theft. It's a simple message and it's completely ridiculous, but I see that popping up all over the place.
Well, the other thing is, Shaquille, do you know what they call what some call the estate tax in the United States? They call it the death tax.
It is a death tax.
Well, that's what they call it. That's what. It's a disgusting tax. Let me finish. And then when I said the person who came up with that name, who happens to be a friend of mine, okay, he came out with that name. I said, well, you call that the death tax, but what about the birth burden? He said, what do you mean? The 125 trillion in liabilities and unfunded promises that we're putting on the backs of young people and future generations. What about the birth burden? When are we going to start doing something about that? He goes, oh, don't talk about that.
I'm glad you brought that up, Dave, because when I was in Dubai and you brought that up, we didn't have enough time for me to respond to that. So I've had plenty of time to think about this.
We have to do a whole show on that because
let's do that. Let's do that. Let's don't get into it now. Let's do it.
Well, not now, but that guy got me fired.
Let me just make one comment. It's not going to be a debate. I just want to make one very quick comment. You said that you didn't feel that people were taxed enough during their lifetimes. I would say that you don't account for those people that have earned a lot because of decisions that they've made, but have sacrificed time with their kids and their families. And I think that, again, if you're going to take people's inheritances, why don't you take everybody's inheritance? Why is it only over a particular threshold? Because everybody should be wearing that birth burden, not just the children of.
But for the record, I didn't give you what my position was on the estate tax, so don't attribute that.
We'll have an entire show on it.
That'll be an entire show. You were making an assumption
into an area I worked in for 17 years.
Oh, I bet.
Doing estate planning. One of my clients I did the estate plan for was the founding family of Coca-Cola, the founder of Dunkin' Donuts, the president of Bausch & Lomb, the president of Kimberly-Clark. And then after working with all these people, I got fired because your friend repealed the federal estate tax. Yeah, that's how I got fired, because the minute the estate tax was repealed, I was out of a job. And that's the reason I'm in pensions.
Well, Duncan just got,
So,
Duncan,
so this is the issue, right?
We'll be
You
talking
want there to
about
be
that.
you want there to be a complex and inefficient tax system, because the
We'll
argument
talk.
could be made. Look at all the great jobs that are going to be lost by the lawyers and the accountants and the tax advisors and the accountants who come up with all of these schemes
Grits,
to evade
frats,
those
ruts,
taxes.
and flats. Okay, we'll get
and
into grits, frats,
Duncan
ruts,
just
and-
got sold for $9 billion.
Yeah, I know.
Wow. Hey,
Yeah.
David, I know we're winding down
We're
and getting ready to
winding
end, but I've got a very important question to you that is related because we started a new show today and everything. That is our new sports show with some university students from George Washington. So that started earlier this morning.
Oh, that's
So
cool.
I noticed the Navy information behind you and everything. So I just want to know so I can let the folks from George Washington and Second Take know how is Navy going to do in football? This is a very important question, and it's an economic question. I know y'all are 1-1, but how are we going to do in football this year since that is your alma mater?
It's not my alma mater. I was a professor there. I did have an appointment to go there, but I've got a bad left ear, so I couldn't go. I don't think we're going to qualify for a bowl this year. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
No bowl trip for you.
No bowl trip for us, but
Yeah.
what's the trip for us right now is we got to end the show, but we want to thank
Right.
the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, and also our panel from around the world. Next week, we may be getting into the federal estate tax. Boy, would like that one. But in the meantime, thank you everybody on 9/11, and we will see you all next week. Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. Take care. Have a good week. Bye.